Welcome to this online seminar jointly hosted by the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law at UNSW and the Electoral Regulation Research Network. My name is Paul Kildea. I teach and research at UNSW in public law with a focus on elections and referendums. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing today and pay respects to their elders past and present. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which all of you are standing today, and to also pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today's topic is federal voter ID laws. So the federal government has introduced a voter ID bill to Parliament in the last week, and the government intends for it to be enacted in time for the next federal election, which is due by May of next year. So the bill requires people to present identification prior to receiving a ballot paper at a polling place. And the bill has already prompted a great deal of discussion, even in just these few days. And for the government, it says that it's a modest, sensible reform and that no voter will be denied a vote if they do not have, because they do not have acceptable form of identification. On the other hand, critics argue that it's unnecessary and that it will have a disproportionate impact on certain groups within the community. So there's a lot to discuss, and we've got a great panel for you today to discuss both the proposed law and also a range of other matters relating to voter ID. So let me introduce our panel. Speaking first today will be Graeme, who is a Professor of Law at the University of Queensland and an election law specialist. We also have Rosalind Dixon, Professor of Law at UNSW and Director of the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law. Speaking third is Dani Larkin, who's a public lawyer and representative of the Senior Dialogue Leadership for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Dani is also a lecturer and Deputy Director of the Indigenous Law Centre at UNSW. And we have also Alice Drury, who is a senior lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre, where she leads research and advocacy on Australian democracy. So in terms of how today will work, I'll ask each of our speakers to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. And so I invite people to write their questions into the chat. Feel free to do that while the speakers are speaking or at the end, and I'll keep an eye on it and do my best to put as many questions as I can to the speakers. So that's enough from me. Let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to you, Graeme, to kick us off.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for attending. I can see there's over 80 people. That's extraordinary in such short notice. And I should acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the lands of the Yugger and Turrbal peoples in what's otherwise known as Brisbane. Now, voter ID. Voter ID, we have to understand, for many conservatives, is an article of faith. Temperamentally, they fret about election security and integrity, and they think that people who don't fret about it are far too trusting. To be honest, many countries have voter ID. Great Britain is soon to require it. So for many people out there, it feels like common sense. But what is common sense is often more common than sensible. This proposal is similar to one in the mid-2010s in Queensland that lasted for one election and which I studied. As Paul said, it will require everyone voting in person to present some documentary ID. But photo ID is not required. Besides Medicare cards and various other government cards and documents, even a utility bill with your name on it should suffice. In our law as well, document includes electronic material, things that you might hold on your mobile phone, such as a copy of a utility bill. As well, letters from certain Indigenous bodies will count. As well as that, a fellow elector can vouch for you. And most of all, as Paul said, if you lack suitable ID, you'll be asked to make a provisional vote. A written rigmarole, but a bit like a postal vote. So this is not in any realistic sense a voter suppression measure. If we were importing US voter wars, they would be making it harder to vote by mail, to vote early, to vote with assistance, of mobile polling stations in remote areas and so on. That's very much Trump's shtick. Indeed, the government could have plumped for the Canadian model, and in election law on political finance and integrity, we're often looking to the Canadian system. In Canada, if you don't have ID and no one to vouch for you, you can't vote at all. And the government hasn't even plumped for the UK approach, Mr. Boris Johnson's approach. And I noticed Senator McGrath, my former student, is a Boris Johnson aide in the past. And the UK approach is to require photo ID, which then requires it to spend tens of millions of pounds every election trying to make sure that people can have access to photo ID. So if this doesn't pass, Australia and New Zealand will begin to look like outliers. And I stress here, New Zealand also does not have voter ID and isn't planning to have it. But I think we'll be happy outliers if this doesn't pass. Ultimately, proponents of erecting hurdles to something as fundamental as the franchise, I think, have to prove their case. You can't just say, oh, the appearance of integrity demands this. That's a circular argument. In Australia, we have direct enrolment, compulsory turnout, and a long history of independent and well-funded national electoral agencies. So we also have a high and deserved level of trust in elections. Voter ID might feel right to a lot of people, but what actually does it prevent? It could, in theory, prevent impersonation. That's if I go and vote in your name. But there's no evidence that that's a problem in Australia. And if it was, the way to avoid it is to maximise turnout. And I stress that. Integrity and participation doesn't have to be in tension. Really, they should be in harmony. Voter ID can't prevent multiple voting. A minor and sporadic problem in Australia. Only automatic online crossing out of voters at the polling stations on the roll can really prevent that, but it's not a huge problem anyway. Ultimately, my concerns with the proposal are threefold. Cost in a time of COVID, it contradicts compulsory voting, and it will have inconsistent effect and an impact on trust. So first of all, cost. Cost includes the cost of training thousands and thousands of casual poll clerks in the next few months, the cost of voter education, and the cost of delays in polling, people going through the rigmarole, including of the provisional voting process, when 4 out of 6 states will be enduring their first actual wave, community wave of the virus. Secondly, it contradicts compulsory turnout. For almost 100 years, you've been fined in Australia for not turning out to vote. With voter ID, you might be deterred from voting when you hear, perhaps on polling day, that you require ID which you may not have. And ironically, anyone who doesn't want to vote now has an easy excuse. Oh, sorry, Electoral Commission, I misplaced my wallet and thought that voter ID meant strictly voter ID. Thirdly, inconsistency of effect and impact on trust, and we'll hear more about this. But even the soft touch voter ID that's proposed here will have an effect. Yeah, sure, it makes the ritual of voting a bit more solemn and involved, and that's not entirely all bad. But to the extent that more of the very young, the very old, the remote and Indigenous folk will have trouble with ID, the experience of voting, our one equalising birthright, will be burdened. Remember, we don't have an egalitarian national ID card, unlike European nations. We don't have that because Liberals and Conservatives opposed it some years ago. Tens of thousands of casual polling clerks will have to administer this law as they work 10 to 14-hour polling days. They'll be looking at utility bills on cracked mobile screens. All of this is being done in the name of trust. But when you make a provisional vote without voter ID, you're putting an envelope in a black box. You never actually find out if your vote was admitted to the count. And finally, there is a thin end of the wedge concern. Once entrenched, it will not be a big step in the future for a Senate to empower the minister to set more restrictive ID requirements. Actually, I think that is unlikely in the future because of our traditions in Australia. But what is very likely is that at next year's election, it'll be marked by some extra cost, extra confusion, and some inconsistency. And in a pandemic year, the AEC needs that like a hole in the head. As to voter turnout, it's unlikely it will be noticeably affected. In the Queensland study I did, the number of provisional votes due to voter ID was about 0.6% of total turnout. Turnout was down 1%, but that was from one baseball bat election to another. But that said, remote and regional electors in particular clearly had more problems with voter ID in Queensland. And provisional ballots for voter ID hurdles in the big remote areas varied from 1% to 2%. So we should certainly be concerned about electorates like Lingiari, which covers most of the Northern Territory. In the end, what's going to happen with this law is that Labor will repeal it if and when it gets into power. And what we will have, like prisoner voting in the past, is a new political football to kick around, which is not exactly the metaphor you want for something as essential as voting rights. And as for integrity, and I'll finish on this point, Mr. Palmer is pumping millions of dollars already into his two-man political party, just as he pumped $80 million into the last election campaign, distorting equality and deliberation. Now that really is an integrity issue. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Graeme. A great deal covered there in your 7 minutes. Let's move straight on to Professor Dixon.
Thank you so much, Paul. And like others, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to the meeting from Gadigal land on which UNSW's campus sits, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander colleagues joining, as well as using this as an opportunity to note my support for a voice to Parliament as meaningful acknowledgement of country. I also want to say a very quick thank you on behalf of the Gilbert and Tobin Centre. As Graeme noted, we've got over 100 people joining us, and we put this together jointly with the Electoral Research Network very quickly, and it's wonderful to see lots of people interested in these issues. And I want to thank our co-panelists and Paul, as well as Ju Chong Tam and others at the ERRN for being so generous and collaborative in putting together this event so quickly. So my perspective is very much the non-expert on this panel, because I don't work on election law per se, but I bring a comparative as well as a constitutional perspective to the issue. And I really just want to highlight three things about the comparative and one about the constitutionality. So the first is about what comparison teaches us about possibility. The two is about the issues of fit that one might be worried about, and the third is about dangers, and then I'll turn to constitutionality. So as Graeme notes, this is an area of regulation where most democracies have some kind of regulation in place. And one of the values of looking around the world is we can look at the best and the worst ways of doing it. And clearly there is some learning embodied in what the federal government is proposing, but I think there's still more we can learn. And one of the ways we learn is by looking not just at possibilities that are, legal possibilities, but possible impacts. And I think, Graeme has done great work along with others in Queensland that show us the possible dangers in terms of impact, but I think the rest of the world can also teach us that. So the first is about negative and positive possibilities as what we learn from looking to other electoral regulation regimes. The second is, I think, when we do comparison and learn from other systems, we have to worry about fit. And one of the things I do think is worth emphasising, and Graeme says New Zealand and Australia are becoming outliers, perhaps in our family of Commonwealth countries, but Australia is a system of compulsory voting. And I think that's a really important thing to note. And if that were the sort of starting point, you'd be looking at Brazil, or you'd be looking at some of the European countries that have compulsory voting as your touchstone. And my suggestion is that if you think about compulsory voting as a system in which we see voting as a civic duty far more than a right, there is a real tension between requiring people to go through various hurdles in order to exercise the right to the franchise, because it sends a message that it's a privilege rather than a duty. Of course, it's both, but our system is predicated on widespread participation and encouraging people to vote. I mean, there's Judith Brett's famous rendition of the barbecue as the encouragement to vote. But the reality is that it's encouraged by a wide range of measures, by a modest fine, by it being on Saturday, by being their pre-polling options, it being very easy to vote. And when you do go up there on your Saturday to your local polling place, if you're able to, it being a reasonably seamless and pleasant experience. And erecting barriers to that and making it seem legalistic, bureaucratic and difficult is something that may deter turnout, as Graeme has shown, but also sends a symbolic message that I think undermines a very, very important part of our democratic fabric. And that fabric shouldn't be taken for granted. Increasing numbers of people don't register so that they can't be then engaged by the system. And we need to be very mindful about encouraging voting as part of our tradition and seeing it as a duty, not simply a right. So that's the fit point. And the other aspect of fit is regulation makes sense when you've got an identified risk or danger. And there are countries where there have been instances of abuse that need to be countered. But as others have pointed out, there is very little evidence in Australia from the AEC or anyone else to suggest that multiple voting or voting on behalf of people who are not the registered voter is a meaningful problem in Australian elections. The AEC's best estimate was 0.03%. And what does that mean? That means that there's a real danger here that you're fixing a problem that doesn't exist, and in the process, you're causing real harm. One of the harms that Dani's going to talk about more in due course, and which I think is really important to emphasise, and Graeme's research backs this up, is that the kind of people most likely to be impacted adversely by these laws are people who are already disadvantaged in our political system and are overwhelmingly First Nation or from culturally diverse backgrounds. The good news in Australia is that more people have ID than in countries like the US. And so this isn't going to bite and preclude many people from voting. But of those who will be precluded or disadvantaged or discouraged, a very significant number will be First Nation voters. And that has impacts, as Graeme says, in certain electorates, like are in the Northern Territory, but it also has broader equity considerations that we need to be very alive to. And Dani's going to talk more, I believe, about that. The other danger of responding to a problem of this kind without demonstrable risk or danger is that there's inevitably an adverse impact that one has to weigh. But my broadest comment would really be that this kind of move, and it is generally a conservative move, trades off the kind of seeming reasonableness and sensible nature of the reforms, but in effect is part of a broader global movement to suppress turnout and voting by those who tend to vote for more progressive politics and policies and governments. And that it's straight out of the Republican playbook in the United States. Graeme says also the Johnson playbook in the United Kingdom. And one of the things that I think we have to really hold on to if we're going to promote the best kind of democracy in Australia is the sense that regulation should be a response to real problems that are backed up by evidence. And that one of the things that allowed Trump to get away with the claims of rigged elections or a problem in electoral integrity in the United States is that over the last 4 years and more, there's been a growing distance between identified evidence-based claims policymaking and this political response. And if we say, well, of course, there could always be integrity issues, so we act now, there's this danger of creating a politics which is, in a sense, allowing discourse and regulation to proceed without a sufficient evidentiary basis. And that is really the slippery slope to a fake news, political claiming situation or culture where it's very real dangers to democracy of a kind I hope we never see in Australia and we haven't seen to date, but where that's the danger. Regulating without data or without demonstrable problems does raise really serious concerns if you think about the voter suppression efforts that have followed January 6th and earlier November of last year in the United States. So my concern is that this is seemingly common sense, but it has racial disparate impact. It has a discouragement that fails to identify the nature of Australian-based duties in voting, and that creates a politics of responding to non-evidence-based claims in ways that are very dangerous. And so, like others, I think it's a very concerning development that we should be really scrutinising very carefully. And I would suggest that the High Court would do the same under, the doctrine is obviously quite complicated, but essentially they're looking for whether any burden, effective burden on the franchise is reasonably necessary or adapted to its purpose. And if there isn't evidence of a problem, it's going to be very hard for the law to satisfy that kind of necessity test. And so my own argument would be that there is, on the data we have at the moment, both a political problem and a very real constitutional doubt around these proposed laws. Thank you, Paul. I look forward to discussing more.
Thanks so much, Ros. And now we're going to hear from Dani Larkin.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dani Larkin. I'm a Bundjalung Kanarakan woman, and I'd just like to pay my respects from the land that I'm dialing in on from today, which is Gadigal country. So Indigenous people fall into each of the vulnerable categories of voters political commentary has identified this week and last. They are people who are financially vulnerable, living in poverty, They're people that are living in remote communities with minimal access to support services and with a small spread out population, making it harder for those people to find someone to vouch for them. They are homeless people and, of course, those who are of Indigenous descent. In fact, Indigenous people occupy alarmingly high statistics in all of those categories, despite being less than 3% of Australia's overall population. Furthermore, research conducted from the Australian Electoral Commission in 2016 suggests that approximately 58% of Indigenous people were enrolled to vote. However, this was viewed as a generous estimate of Indigenous voter engagement, with a more realistic enrolment figure perceived to be at 50%. In addition, a private assessment conducted by Indigenous leaders, non-government and government agencies found that approximately 25 to 30% of Indigenous people who are enrolled actually cast a formal vote. I note Minister for Indigenous Australians Ken Wyatt's media release last week on the 28th of October, where he drew upon data and stated that the estimated Indigenous enrolment rate lifted from 74.7% in 2017 to 79.3% in 2021. However, enrolment rates aren't obviously not inclusive of voter turnout rates and rates of votes actually being casted, and those that are actually being counted. I'd suggest these issues and figures are indicative of broader systematic challenges facing Indigenous political participation in Australia, yet nothing's being done about it. Instead, we have the Morrison government's proposed electoral changes adding additional red tape to the voting process, which does not provide incentive for those who are already disenfranchised to politically engage. I also note Senator Patrick Dodson's media release on Friday, the 29th of October, where he stated the government knows full well that First Nations people have always struggled to obtain ID documents, as basic as a birth certificate, because of an absence of records or because of difficulties in accessing and navigating official services, difficulties that are often exacerbated because of remoteness and language and communication disadvantages. Accordingly, there should be as few barriers to Indigenous people casting a vote as possible. Despite the difficulty in calculating unregistered births across Australia, a study conducted in Western Australia in 2016 found that there are lower rates of birth registrations amongst Aboriginal Australians compared to non-Aboriginal Australians. And according to the study, many Aboriginal Australians do not have registered birth certificates when they're infants. This was common amongst Aboriginal children from disadvantaged families, who are also shown to be 9 times less likely than non-Aboriginal people to have their births registered. The study also found that there are significant barriers in the birth registration process that can contribute to Aboriginal families not registering births. Generally, those barriers included situations where the mother was a teenager when they had their first child, who lived in a remote area without private healthcare insurance, and whose birth was not registered. The most likely circumstances for non-registration occurred where the parent was disadvantaged through having lower levels of literacy, which made it difficult for them to complete the application form whilst trying to look after a newborn baby. Despite assistance being available through the birth registry, access to staff is difficult for those residing in really remote areas. The financial disadvantage was another common factor, given most Aboriginal parents living within remote communities had higher unemployment rates and were unable to afford the fee for a birth certificate. Despite electoral legislation allowing persons without photo ID to enrol with the support of a stat dec signed by a person who's identified to vouch for their identity, there remains a barrier for Aboriginal electors. Those who reside in remote communities may lack the incentive to enrol to vote in the first place because of that initial barrier, compounded by the task of finding someone to vouch for their identity through a stat dec. Inevitably, some Aboriginal citizens will remain off the voter rolls. There is another way in which low rates of birth registration intersects with high rates of incarceration to compound Indigenous people's disenfranchisement. We know that the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918, Section 93, subsection 8AA, disqualifies prisoners from voting if they're serving a prison sentence of 3 years or more. We know that Australia's national incarceration statistics evidence a disproportionately high representation of Aboriginal Australians imprisoned. We occupy 27% of Australia's national prison population. The statistic was acknowledged by the Australian Law Reform Commission report, Pathways to Justice, inquiry into the incarceration rate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And in addition, the incarceration report found that unlicensed driving offences greatly contribute to Indigenous Australians being overrepresented in incarceration. Those without a birth certificate are unable to get a driver's licence. Those in remote areas, in particular, depend on driving to cover the vast distances between families and services. Without a licence, many drive regardless, which leaves those persons open to being found guilty of driving a vehicle without a licence. The offence is typically one that occurs in emergency and high needs situations where an Indigenous person needs to, or is the only one able to, illegally however, drive a vehicle to attend a hospital for an emergency and or lives in a remote community and needs to travel to get groceries, etc. The incarceration report also revealed that incarcerated Aboriginal Australians are also likely to be affected by mental illnesses and illiteracy issues. So being deemed of unsound mind can also be a disqualifying barrier to voting and at Commonwealth elections. So as you can see, the proposed voter ID requirements actually intersect with a number of other political participation barriers for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And arguably, these barriers are another reason why Indigenous people need a constitutionally protected voice to Parliament when their means of representation within it is so limited. Thank you, everyone. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Dani. Great. And now move to our fourth and final speaker, Alice Drury.
Thanks, Paul. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the country of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation today, pay my respects to the elders past and present, and also extend those respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call today, and also the advocates, First Nation advocates who are really leading the charge blocking this bill. And just to echo Professor Dixon, we have a really strong culture of treating every vote as sacred in this country. But the impact of these laws is that they will practically disenfranchise many people. As we've heard from Dr Larkin, they'll hit hardest Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, particularly those living in remote communities, people experiencing homelessness, people experiencing mental health issues, elderly people. These are exactly the people that we should have better represented in our parliaments, not be locked out of yet another avenue to power. And we've also heard that there's precious little evidence supporting these laws, but there's an overwhelming amount of evidence to indicate that they can be used to suppress votes. What I wanted to focus on today was some sort of practical points that the government has made in favour of these laws, and also, what we're doing at the Human Rights Law Centre and what others can do to block this bill. So, firstly, to sort of debunk a couple of things, it's really normal for a lot of people not to have one of the IDs listed in the bill. Dr Larkin's already gone through a couple of reasons why. If you're born on country, you might not ever be given a birth certificate, which is a huge barrier to then getting other forms of ID. In addition, not everyone uses the Western calendar and not every culture celebrates birthdays. That's definitely not the norm across the country. So it's very normal not to have a birth date or a birth certificate. In addition, you might have had ID, but it expired, and the bureaucratic barriers to renewing it are huge if you live hundreds of kilometres from a government office or if you don't have internet. If you're moving from place to place a lot, if you're visiting family or community, you might not have it on you. And also, if you're experiencing homelessness, you probably have nowhere safe to keep your ID. So I think normalising this idea that you might not have ID on you on the day that you vote is really, really important to combating this bill. Second, declaration votes are not a safety net. Again, Dr Larkin's already gone through the barriers to enrolling for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and declaration votes will operate in the same way. What many people will hear is voter ID laws. What that will mean to them is that if you don't have an ID, you're not going to be able to cast a vote. They won't even think to turn up. So declaration votes won't help in a lot of instances. Also, the declaration votes themselves are extremely confusing. As currently drafted, they ask for your permanent address, your driver's license and passport number. Technically, people may not have to fill in that detail, but however, they're not going to know that. And it's also likely that many electoral officers won't know that. When these laws were temporarily in place in Queensland, electoral officers wrongly turned voters away when they didn't have ID. And finally, there are issues already with declaration votes. The process of verifying identity under tight timelines meant that in the 2010 federal election, about 28,000 declaration votes weren't counted. We should also be deeply cynical, and we should all be asking why the government is pursuing these laws now. They serve as a distraction from talking about the actual integrity problems in our democracy. We've got allegations of corruption and pork barrelling, secret donations, sexual assault in Parliament, all of which have gone to date unaddressed. We've also got, or inadequately addressed at most. We also have issues with our elections specifically, including, as Professor Orr pointed out, the unchecked spread of disinformation and unprecedented millions that Clive Palmer is spending to flood our airwaves to skew election outcomes. So there is a long, long list of integrity reforms that the Morrison government could pick from, and he's picked the one that there's no evidence for, that will disenfranchise people, and is absolutely the worst thing that he could have done, in my opinion. And also, Dr. Larkin made reference to a significant underinvestment by the government in getting information in language to remote communities, and the sort of lack of will to address the existing barriers to enrolment and to voting. So, if you care deeply about electoral integrity, then that's where we should be focusing our efforts. What these laws do is raise an opportunity for the government and for Pauline Hanson to talk about voter fraud, and that has been a highly successful tactic to further undermine trust in elections, of course, as we've seen in the United States. And just talking about it as a problem can lead people to doubt the process of voting. This is a really dangerous precedent to be following here in Australia. So practically, I wanted to talk as well about messaging for anyone doing advocacy on this issue, or even people wanting to talk to their friends on this issue. The first of which is to speak from values, and also to speak from a strengths-based approach, particularly when talking about how these laws will impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And I wanted to give a shout out to Passing the Message Stick, which is amazing, really well-researched, kind of gold standard messaging that's freely available on the Passing the Message Stick website. Particularly speaks to talking about justice for First Nations people, but the principles are excellent and should be deployed, I think, basically in all circumstances. And second, just a kind of moment to say that we should be avoiding talking about voter fraud and using the phrase voter fraud, because that will unfortunately just perpetuate the aims of what I believe to be the aims of this bill, is to make it a conversation. Finally, in terms of practically what the Human Rights Law Centre is doing together with other partners in the sector, is most likely we will need to block this bill in the Senate, which means asking people in South Australia to reach out to Senators Sterling Griff and Rex Patrick, and anyone in Tasmania to reach out to Jackie Lambie's office, particularly if you're someone who might be impacted, or if you're in contact with people who might be impacted by this bill. That's all from me. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks to all our speakers. And I can already see a few questions in the chat, which I've made a note of, and come to them very soon. If any of you would like to throw a question to one of our panelists, then please make use of the chat function. I thought I'd just begin by playing a little bit of devil's advocate. And so the government has put a range of different justifications for the bill forward. And one that I've kind of heard a lot in terms of, media I've paid attention to this week, is this idea that we need to show ID in a range of other everyday activities. And so James McGrath, Senator, who is the chair of the J Scheme, said, if I want to go to my local surf club or bowls club, I have to show a form of photo ID. but I don't when I'm voting. So, why is that? And he then goes on to say that electoral matters must not only be fair, open and transparent, they must be seen to be so. And so I guess the question for any panelists who want to come in on that is, isn't there something to that? I mean, we've talked a bit about evidence. There's not really any evidence of personation, but perhaps trust isn't about evidence at the end of the day. And the argument is that by introducing a voter ID requirement, that is going to build up trust. And that should be a good thing, and that it would be an open way of demonstrating that in our electoral system. So over to any of our panelists who have a response to those kind of perspectives, such as those put forward by Senator McGrath.
Paul, I was asked on Canberra Radio earlier in the week about, if I wanted to go to the bottle shop and buy a bottle of wine, or, Jack Daniels was the exact beverage of choice the host used, I have to show ID. I said, yeah, but you don't have a sort of public duty to go and buy Jack Daniels or go to the surf club. That the duty aspect to it, I think, is really worth stressing, which is a lot of the things that we have to show ID for are a privilege, and that, voting is part of our absolute civic fabric and duty. And I think that there's also a rationale there, which is underage drinking is not an ephemeral, made up problem. It's a problem that's a serious safety and public health issue in a lot of contexts. And so there's an evidence-based reason for that ID requirement, which there just isn't here. I thought Ian's suggestion in the chat about cross-checking through electronic cross-off was a really interesting, worth discussing and hearing other people's feedback. Sam says it could be expensive, but as Graeme says, it's not like checking IDs free. I think the other broader thing, though, that's really tricky about this, and this picks up on what Alice and Graeme said, as well as the chat from Kim Rubenstein, is that trust is a circular phenomenon. It's like if we raise doubts, we undermine trust. And yet if we provide certain forms of assurance, we maybe increase trust. But the very discourse around this bill seems to do more to undermine trust than to promote it. And I think that's one of the really vexed parts of it.
I think if I could just sort of chime in too, Ros. I mean,
Thanks.
Look, from an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous people aren't, especially in remote communities, they're not going to their local surf club or their local bottle shop every Friday and don't have the privilege of even accessing such venues. And probably that's not even on their priority list if they're in utter financial poverty, which is the main issue here. And getting onto trust, I mean, it comes down to, this is why Indigenous people don't have necessarily trust in their current representatives in Parliament. It's because of that disconnect. There's a disconnection there with understanding the magnitude of oppression and lived experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote and regional communities. And to set that statement in and of itself from McGrath is like clear evidence of that. And so what you get is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people going, well, there you have it. We've got someone here that's a senator meant to be representing different constituent interests, and he has no connection, if any at all, like to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lived experiences and lack of access to obtaining, the financial support and to be able to obtain voter ID requirements to satisfy that, to be able to vote.
Thanks, Dani. So, Graeme, I'm going to go to you now. I can see your hand up, and I thought just as part of that, a couple of people have asked in the chat about lessons to learn from Queensland, so feel free to address that as part of your response.
Yeah, so the point about trust is not an insignificant one, because trust in the system, whether it's high or low, is important to democracy, and courts around the world recognise that, and political philosophy recognise that, and so on. And I'm aware that when I put forward proposals sometimes about capping donations, I'm part of a set of voices that often are asserting that the appearance of money passing, even if we can't prove corruption, is problematic in itself. But the difference there is that money is a tangible thing, and that we do know, we have clear survey data over decades to show that Australian people are very concerned about the inequality of access to political processes and so on. So that's where I draw the line with Senator McGrath without saying that as a matter of principle, what he's saying is stupid. I'm happy to take particular questions about the Queensland experience, but I'll hand back to Paul.
Yeah, so there is some interest in the Queensland experience, Graeme, I guess in particular in terms of your research and the, I guess, what communities did you find that to have the biggest impact on? Is there anything there in particular that you'd like to highlight that we could learn going forward for the Commonwealth?
Right. So, I mean, certain things that I've already put forward. There was a bill about voter ID just a month or two ago from the One Nation Party, which the government didn't support, but now they're pushing forward very much the same proposal. That if this is to go through, there's certain things we do need certainly to do. And one is to ensure the Electoral Commission is doing proper, detailed, fine-grained research about this, because in the Queensland case, it just didn't happen at all. The government didn't care, the Electoral Commission didn't have the resources, and so it was left to me and an oily rag to look at what we call ecological data. So we can only do it at the level of electorate level. And, when you're talking about, say, young and old people with problems accessing ID, that just doesn't come out in the wash, because so all we could do is to show that, yes, remote and highly regional communities and those electorates that were the vastest or had the largest Indigenous populations had the most effect. As I said, the effect wasn't great in terms of the number of people who turned up and their ID was not good enough or they were rejected, but we obviously don't know how many people mightn't have turned up because they didn't understand that they were still entitled to vote, and that's going to be a real problem with the messaging, both for the government, the Electoral Commission, but also for activists in this area. So, I mean, some of the lessons are that, yeah, if we worried about this, as Alice said, there are things that you can do, obviously, because in the Australian system, you can assist people to vote. Scrutineers can take people in to help make sure that they can cast a proper and provisional ballot. But on top of that, I also think it's outrageous that you could have to drive a long distance, particularly in a remote or regional electorate, to get to the polling station, and then you're never told whether your vote's accepted in the count. I also note that this isn't a proposal that requires postal voters to photocopy ID, and that's kind of understandable because they already have to go through rigmaroles, but it's interesting that we don't impose that on postal voters, and they tend to be older citizens. So, and yet this is the very sort of thing in the US where they really want to suppress vote, where they're trying to stop postal voting and things of that nature.
Sorry, Alice, did you have your hand up? No. So thanks very much, Graeme. And there's a bit of comment about electronic mark-off in the chat. I understand the AEC is looking to kind of roll that out more, and potentially that can address accidental mark-offs, supposed multiple voting. But there's a question, I guess, it's the number of devices, as someone has commented in the chat, and also the question of whether you want to rig your electoral roll up to the internet and whether that's going to open it up to kind of hacking concerns. I want to go to, I should also say Anthony Green has written about Queensland's lessons as well, if anyone wanted to pursue that on his blog. I just thought, Alice, in relation to your comment that we should be cynical about the government's agenda here, just want to tease that out a bit. I mean, is your sense that there's an electoral gain to be had by introducing voter ID laws? And it came up in your talk as well, like in the sense that it seems to me that, playing devil's advocate, I should say, that if the impact of voter ID, while real, is it of sufficiently large scale to actually potentially shift an outcome in a seat or not? Could it just be, this idea of voter ID is an enduring one. It's been recommended by multiple J schemes over the last decade. Is it not so much to do with potential electoral gain as it is to do with just concerns about fraud, like a philosophical concern about fraud in the way that Graeme kind of identified earlier?
Yeah, I haven't seen any data to indicate that this bill could flip seats. And I'm not sure, I think some folks are looking at doing that number crunching. I don't think anyone's had a chance to do it yet. My point is less that, and it's more, there is a philosophical, not evidence-based, but philosophical concern about the potential for future, people in the future voting multiple times, etc. And there is a very, very real known outcome of that, which is that people will be disenfranchised. So I think the cynicism that I speak to is why introduce these laws now when there's no problem? And I think that's because, as I mentioned before, it's a distraction from the very real problems that the government is facing in terms of integrity within the party and systemic problems with our democracy. And I think it also gives some folks, including Pauline Hanson, an opportunity to talk about voter fraud when it's a really, really hot topic in the United States. So it kind of appeals as well to that conspiracy right faction.
Can I say something about that, Paul, as well? I think that, there isn't real voter demand for this, but there is a degree to which we now sort of see packages of policies coming from other countries. So if you're a conservative, you need to be in favour of these sorts of laws as sort of a package, and that's a US, British increasingly package, and we need to resist that infecting our politics, that we can have, crossover discussions, that we can interrogate policies on their own merits. And that I don't think the broad swath of voters, know about, care about, or certainly wouldn't support this if it was put to them and explained fully. But it is a sort of messaging to the base that is a dangerous pattern of kind of taking, if you like, a whole package, some of which is really undesirable. And so we need to hold the government to account and say, we can see this as part of a broader ideological package that, even though it seems quite sensible in many ways, has a really troubling effect for First Nations and very troubling broader sort of symbolism and cast, which is taking discourse that in the US is very, very dangerous and putting it into Australia in a way that we really need to resist. So I think it's much more about the base and the broader vote, and calling the government out on that might be very important to our ability, as Alice said, to draw attention to senators who aren't members of the coalition, and or to get people thinking about the dangers. So there's some interesting discussion as well in the chat about whether the actual evidence there does support the suggestion. And I think both Peter and Anthony Graeme had something interesting to say about that. I'll turn it back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Ros. And also in the chat just a little bit earlier, had someone asking a question about is there a need to be putting more effort into making it ID more accessible for First Nations people and also homeless people. I mean, I don't know if, Dani, if you had anything to say about that. I mean, I guess, would your concerns about voter ID be lessened if you knew that ID was made more readily available, or is that to you, it's just one of many issues that are at play here?
I think you've got to think of this as like a suite of different law and policy reform options that would all work towards enhancing and providing incentive to First Nation voters. Yeah. So like I referred to the media release when I was talking before by our Minister for Indigenous Australians, Cam Wyatt. And he noted in that media release that the government is looking at putting in more funding towards different initiatives to increase Indigenous voter turnout and engagement, political participation programs in Indigenous communities. That's something that has been established for like decades now, but it doesn't seem to be working, is my point. So like whilst, maybe the AEC working, which it very well can, with births, deaths and marriages in different state and territory jurisdictions in working out financial support opportunities for Indigenous people and communities to be able to obtain a birth certificate and therefore be able to go on and get photo ID. I think it comes down to like, yes, that's great, and it would help and that would be beneficial. But there's also this thing that's here, and it's the political attitude of people in Parliament, making a very real legislative commitment in laws to actually recognise these types of substantive rights of First Nation people. So I spoke about the voice to Parliament and the reason why we're advocating so hard for that, because we don't see ourselves within Parliament. And there is a thing where even when we do get in, we're part of a minority again. And so the representation there is it's not very representative at all, in fact. And so it comes down to, issues of trust. It comes down to our reality, our political reality, and in fact, our political invisibility when we're talking about representation. And it comes down to also, I think, like working out different ways, if we're not going to make a real legislative commitment here to, ensuring that electoral law actually, supports Indigenous voter turnout, to going, okay, well then what other mechanisms can we offer outside of these institutions to start a process of structural reform that would hopefully have a flow-on effect through intercepting really important law and policy making processes, and therefore maybe even lead to electoral reform on these types of issues through a voice to Parliament that has constitutional protective status.
Thanks, Dani. And I guess maybe moving from parliaments to think of courts. I mean, Ros, you mentioned potential court intervention here. So did you, Graeme. How would you see a challenge to the Voter ID Act, playing out here? Is it something that would necessarily have to wait until after the election in any event? Does Rose set a decent precedent that fraud is something that the courts can look at very seriously and want to see evidence of it? Might go to you first, Rose, and then to Graeme.
Well, others are, going to be better at answering the timing question, but I think there's no doubt that, protecting electoral integrity is a compelling reason to legislate, but there has to be an evidentiary basis or necessity. And, one of the things I do think was interesting in the second Unions case in the context of the implied freedom is that the court held the state parliament to a pretty demanding evidentiary standard in terms of its claims that were underpinning the legislation. So I think there's no doubt that the broad aim of promoting public trust in the electoral process and the integrity of the process is a absolutely constitutionally valid and indeed compelling interest. But that's not enough. There has to be a basis for pursuing that interest in the circumstances, and the burden that's real, that everyone's talked about, has to be justified by reference to some kind of reasonable necessity or appropriate and adapted test. And I think that unless there's a lot more evidence that comes to bear as part of the parliamentary debate and or independent evidence to support that, I don't think the issue is the nature of the purpose. As you say, Paul, it's got some precedent, and I think it is compelling. I think it's whether there's the evidence to suggest that pursuing the purpose here is valid and necessary.
Graeme, feel free to come in if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, look, as much as I love litigation in this area, I wouldn't be pushing it under this bill. I certainly wouldn't be pushing it before the election. One problem is that any plaintiff who it burdens is simply going to be told, well, you can go and get ID. There's a long list of ID, and you can provisionally vote anyway. I'd be looking for evidence maybe after the election on effect. But even then, while it's such a soft form of voter ID, and with this current High Court, I wouldn't actually want to risk a precedent that forecloses things. I'd be saving my powder, as it were, for the possibility that these laws will be tightened and made more restrictive in the future. Again, that's not to say that I think the laws are justified in a political sense, but I think this is also a political and legislative campaign primarily.
Thanks, Graeme. And we've kind of just got a few minutes left. I guess open to any of our panelists. I've kept you all in a very tight leash today. If there's anything in particular you wanted to add in, I might go to Alice first. I mean, you made some really interesting points about declaration votes and just about the availability of a declaration vote isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. It's still going to present a significant barrier for a lot of people. If there's anything else you wanted to say about that, or whether would you would you welcome this bill being referred to a JSCEM inquiry for proper consideration prior to enactment, anything along those lines? Yeah,
in terms of whether it will be referred to JSCEM, there's reasons to doubt that. It's already been considered by JSCEM in their reviews of the last few elections. Also, this came from JSCEM, which is a coalition dominated parliamentary committee. So I don't know if it will be referred to JSCEM. It could be referred to a Senate committee, even a select committee. We'll see if that happens. Ideally, from our perspective, it goes to a vote in the Senate. Ideally the government would retract it presuming they're not going to, will go to a vote in the Senate and it's blocked. And in terms of sort of practical instances of people not being able, like the barriers that they face on the ground, I think there's some excellent organisations and advocates who are pulling together those case studies sort of as we speak. So definitely keep your eyes peeled. And making sure that we have the people who are impacted speaking to their experience of voter ID laws.
Well, one of the things I thought was interesting to note, the chat highlights, and Deborah, and then also an earlier comment. I was just noting who that was from from Damien about homeless people, young people, and people with lived experience of disability are also impacted, and we need to keep that in mind. I think one of the real challenges is, as Damien says, to some extent, especially for First Nations, this highlights the importance of working more to get people access to ID and birth certificates and the formality of existence. And that's going to be more important as we live in a COVID era where documentation of various kinds is important for access to ordinary civic life. And as Dani says, not everyone's lucky enough to have a surf club, down the street, but there's still ways in which being formally recognised by the state, whether it's that driver's licence you need for the emergency or something else, really matters. But we can try and hold on to that instinct, which is, this is the miner's canary about ID, without saying, and by the way, you need ID to vote, because this is again emphasising that it may undermine, not increase trust in the electoral process. And I just kept coming back to, it's a duty. You don't erect barriers in the way of a duty unless there's a really demonstrable problem with how it's being implemented. And so I think it's difficult politically actually to do that messaging at once, but I do think if possible, taking seriously that there's an ID access issue, which is a human rights issue in itself, especially for First Nation, but also for some homeless and other disadvantaged communities. And at the same time, even if we fix that, doesn't mean we necessarily want to be going down this path, because of the symbolism around what compulsory voting and civic duty means. So, I think that's worth bearing in mind. But it's great that we've got all these wonderful experts joining this meeting, so that it's not just the panelists, but all the people teaching us in the chat from their litigation experience, their analysis and their own scholarship and political campaigning. That's a real treat.
So we're just coming up to the hour now, so it's probably a good time to draw a line under it. And I agree, Rosalind. I really just, it's terrific to have such a large audience here today to be here while we discuss this issue. I should say there's a lot to this, and we haven't been able to get to everything. There's much more to say about, say, the impact on electoral commissions and the like, and I will put in a bit of a word for the ACT branch of the ERRN, which is holding its own seminar on voter ID later in the month, where I know Peter Brent is speaking, and so look out for that. That'll be, I guess, around the time where the bill is being discussed in Parliament. But I really want to thank you for being here. I want to thank our speakers who at such short notice have agreed to be here and offer such interesting, diverse perspectives on this issue. So thanks to everyone, and hope to see you all again soon.